Remember Newspeak in 1984? Remember the government motto, freedom is slavery? Well, right now, leftists are displaying a trend in response, it seems, to freedom movements in Canada, the US, and elsewhere. That seems to show that they're resorting to the tactic of claiming that the concept of freedom itself is an aspect of, get this, white supremacy. Yes, George Orwell would be impressed. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV. You know, even in the midst of the gaslighting tsunami of pop media and political attacks on the Canadian Freedom Convoy, in which aggressors attempt to distract attention from their crimes and blame their victims for opposing the criminal aggression, we see how those who demonize people trying to simply be left unmolested will at any time use their gaslighting tactic and postmodernist so-called critical theory to mess with language and use it against anyone who stands in their way. Hence, we see University of Pennsylvania PhD candidate Taylor Dysart's decidedly self-defeating screed published February 11th by the Washington Post. It's a screed that, get this, claims the desire to be free is a, quote, key component of white supremacy, end quote. Let's pause to consider the circular logic of that and think that perhaps Ms. Dysart doesn't understand the meaning of freedom. If she claims that freedom is a facet of white supremacy, and if she doesn't like white supremacy, how can she justify her dislike of this supremacy without calling for freedom from it? Which, according to her merry-go-round of mind torture, is a component of white supremacy. You're gonna have to grab the headache medicine here, I think, because we're gonna dive in even deeper. Evidently using freedom of speech, Dysart claims, quote, in recent weeks, a convoy of truck drivers from across Canada began arriving en masse in Ottawa. The Freedom Convoy traveled to the Canadian capital to protest new vaccination, wink wink, requirements for essential workers, wink wink, crossing the US-Canada land border. Isn't that great how they'll tell you if you're essential? The convoy has amassed significant support. It's now removed GoFundMe raised more than $10 million Canadian and has been celebrated by several center-right and right-wing public figures, including Elon Musk, Joe Rogan, and former President Donald Trump. The Freedom Convoy now touts itself as an anti-all mandates movement, desiring to remove all public health mandates. End quote. All of which, sort of like returning after a really bad long vacation, all of which requires a lot of unpacking before we get to her allegation that this idea of leaving people unmolested is somehow a trait of white supremacy. First, Joe Rogan and Elon Musk are far from right-wing or even center-right figures. Joe not only leans libertarian, he openly discusses his experiences taking hallucinatory drugs, and he and Mr. Musk both smoked pot together during a Joe Rogan Experience podcast. Heck, Rogan once supported the ultra-left Bernie Sanders. Second, as I've noted for MRC-TV, there is no such thing as public health. There is only individual health. People within proximity of each other or arbitrarily categorized by government as a so-called group do not blend into one another as if they're turning into some kind of gestalt creature. They remain individuals, always individuals. When agents of government claim to care for the public health, they enter into a consequentialist world where individuals can be sacrificed for the group. which actually is self-defeating, since putting every individual at risk of being the one sacrificed places every member of the group in danger. Now, Ms. Dysart buys into the flippy ideas, by the way, of Tyler Stovall, whose 2021 Princeton Press book, White Freedom, argues that because the Enlightenment spread of the concept of natural rights coincided with African slaves being brought to the West, somehow the Western view of freedom really is just a smokescreen to perpetuate the dominance of the white man. It's a theme also pushed by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, and Canada's so-called newspaper, The Globe and Mail. But this childish and myopic claim also overlooks the history of slavery and freedom, going all the way back to Babylonia, to Hammurabi's codes, to ancient Egypt and the exodus of the Jews, to ancient Greece and the philosophers such as Aristotle. And numerous etymologists argue that the term slave, that is derived from Slav. As LizBDNet.com notes, quote, "The term slave has its origin in the word Slav. The Caucasian Slavs, who inhabited a large part of Eastern Europe, were taken as slaves by the Muslims of Spain during the 9th century AD. Slavery can broadly be described as the ownership, buying, and selling of human beings for the purpose of forced and unpaid labor." And as Thomas Sowell wrote in 2014, quote, "Slavery was a worldwide curse for thousands of years, as far back as recorded history goes. Over all that expanse of time and space, it is very unlikely that most slaves or most slave owners were either black or white. Slavery was common among the vast populations in Asia. Slavery was also common among the Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved their indigenous peoples before anyone on this side of the Atlantic had ever seen a European. More whites were brought as slaves to North Africa than blacks brought as slaves to the United States or to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. White slaves were still being bought and sold in the Ottoman Empire decades after blacks were freed in the United States." End quote. Ms. Dyson, the CBC, the Globe and Mail, and Mr. Stovall don't seem to understand the worldwide, multiracial practices of slavery, colonialism, and injustice. Nor do they grasp the fact that people have a right not to be enslaved by mandates from other people claiming that they run a thing called government. They don't seem to grasp that the nature of freedom is based on natural rights. What part of asking to be left alone offends Ms. Dysart? If she and her ideological ilk in the progressive playpen actually bothered to acknowledge rights and freedom to oneself and what one peacefully acquires, well then they would have their answer about medical mandates. Controlling a so-called pandemic can best be handled and can only be morally handled by utilizing private action, voluntary association, and free will. In fact, this woman's phobia about freedom from medical mandates, well, that's the default position that all humans always must hold. To stray from that for medicine invites a state-run sacrificial system that far too often has been used to kill or experiment, to sterilize and shut away. To stray from the default for any aspect of human existence, to pull away from individual freedom, is to embrace George Orwell's insanity from 1984, that freedom is slavery. Hey, thank you so much for watching, everybody. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're watching on Rumble, please like and subscribe. Check us out on TikTok. Check us out on Instagram. We're also on Parler and on Facebook and on Twitter. Go to MRCTV.org all the time and check out the MRC Store. The MRC Store. Good stuff. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith, fighting for freedom